Hello, everybody. Welcome back for another episode of the Stokes Sound Podcast. I'm your host, Ed Stokes, and today we have the amazing John Burke from the Perfect Vocals Academy. John, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, man. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you so much. Well, John, tell us a little bit about you and, for the listeners so they know who they're listening to.
Well, I've been an audio engineer for about 14 years. I went to school in Hollywood, California at Musicians Institute way back in 2007, 2008. And then I worked at multiple studios in the Cleveland, Ohio area. After that, like 2009, started my own studio in 2011 in the Ohio area. Recorded a bunch of bands, solo artists, a lot of bands to start. And then it kind of shifted over time around 15, 16, shifted into a lot more solo artists and less bands. And moved to Nashville in 2018, did a bunch of networking down there, worked at a cool studio called The Record Shop with this guy named Sean Giovanni, and met a bunch of artists there, and honestly came back to Ohio in 2020, right at the time of the pandemic, I guess. And I've just been doing remote work, tons of remote mixing, mastering, a little bit of production. I do some production too, like custom production, beats for people and stuff. And yeah, just been a long time, just slaving away at it.
Fantastic. Well, you're super talented from all the stuff I've checked out. Your YouTube channel, Perfect Vocals Academy, is absolutely incredible. And I will tell all the listeners, if you have not been on it, please go and check it out because there's a lot to learn and you've explained things very, very well. And that brings me on to today's topic is all about compression. For mixing engineers, it's probably number one or number two of the most important fundamentals, that being EQ and compression. They are the two I would say most important. If you don't have them, you're going to struggle to get a good mix, I would say. And John, obviously you're a super talented mixing engineer and you know a lot about the fundamentals of mixing. And that's why I wanted to bring you onto this podcast to talk about compression, choices of compression, how to use a compressor, and when not to use a compressor.
Right.
So, if we can just talk a little bit about kind of, I guess, your kind of go-to workflow as far as compression goes and what compressor you're using. I mean, I know that's a lot of questions that I've just kind of put out there, but let's just bring it back to kind of starting. If you've got a vocal or if you've got a bass, kind of what are you going to go for?
Yeah. So for vocals, I mean, it really kind of depends off the style first. So if it's something more aggressive, say I'm working with like a rock singer or somebody that's got a really loud belting voice and then they get quiet, and then, I'll usually reach for like a 1176 style compressor. It's just always been a go-to for more aggressive vocals because you can squash it a little more without it sounding too much and it really glues it together. But then on the other end of the spectrum, when I'm working with people that aren't as aggressive, like maybe a rapper that's not super loud or super quiet, it's more of a consistent sound, or a singer that's kind of consistent, not belting. So I use Waves R-Comp a lot, which is just an old Waves compressor, but it's very transparent. That I found it honestly barely sounds like there's compression on there, and I've learned to love that compressor over the years. But like I said, it's more for the less aggressive vocalists. So those are kind of my two go-tos, but I use other compressors as well, like the LA2A for some nice glue and stuff like that.
Fantastic.
But those are the two starting points for me.
Yeah, I mean the resonance waves, the bundle, they're the best. I mean, I use RVox a lot as well.
The
R-Comp and the RVox are probably the two most famous ones, aren't they? They've been around for decades.
Right. They have, and so many big engineers still use them. I mean, it doesn't matter what fancy compressors come out. It's like, if it's not broken, you just keep using it.
Yeah. So as far as kind of, a question a lot of people have been asking is, how do you go about then? So you've mentioned about how you can choose a compressor for depending on what you're putting the compressor on, i.e. whether it's bass or vocals. But then once you put that on, people often ask, okay, well, I've got now the compressor, but then how much compression shall I do or what is needed? And then the attack and release times and how to understand how to approach the attack and release times when using a compressor. I know a lot of people seem to be asking about that. So in your workflow, let's say we're working on vocals, for example.
Yeah.
What are you looking for when mixing a track, when dialing in the compressor, basically?
Okay, so basically, I like it to be normally a pretty fast attack. But if I really feel like the vocal is sitting too much inside of the mix and I really want it to be in your face, I'll just start dialing it backwards to, a little slower. Because the slower that attack is, the more it's going to bring it forward. And then also your release kind of plays a part in that too. If you start slowing the release, that's going to push it more into the mix, and it's kind of like a glue. I kind of treat release like it's a glue knob. You just kind of turn it slower and it starts to glue more. But then if you turn the release really fast, it's going to bring it forward as much as possible as far as the vocal in the mix. So that's kind of how I gauge it, but I don't normally go too slow with attack times with vocals unless it is maybe like a super dynamic, punchy vocal that you're going for. But in most mixes that I'm doing, you want the vocal to just kind of like sit in one spot and
Yeah,
just be consistent. So, I'd say a fast to medium. If fast is putting it too smushed and like too much into the mix, then I'd go more towards medium, but still on the fast side.
fantastic. And are you using multiple compressors when using a compressor, whether it's for bass or guitars or drums? Are you using? So, I mean, I guess as we're talking about vocals here, are you finding that let's say you want a pop vocal, right, and you're smacking it with an 1176. Obviously, the popular thing to do is then use an LA2A to smooth out the transients. Is that something you do or you approach, or are you more like just set it, forget it, move on?
I have done a lot of double compressors, sometimes even a third compressor back in the day, but I think I'm getting more away from multiple compressors and just kind of fixing the problems more. Like I use a plugin called Soothe and
Great plugin.
dynamic EQ, and just things that are like fixing the thing that's actually popping out. Because if you think about it, if a vocal's going, it's not necessarily half the time that you need more compression. It's just there's these problem frequencies that are just popping out that makes it sound like it needs more compression. So as I've gotten better with tools like that, it makes it to where before just grabbing another compressor, usually I can get away with one to do the heavy lifting and then maybe one other one just for just some subtle, like an LA2A, like you said, just some subtle shine or whatever, or glue.
Like leveling.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's interesting.
That's about
actually.
it.
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously with like newer records and like the new pop stuff, like when you listen to an act like, I don't know, Dua Lipa or Justin Bieber, like their vocals are just, there's not a lot of dynamic in it. It's very just pushed forward in your face. Yep. And flat. And that actually kind of brings me on to a little bit of automation as well, because if you look at like old records, like I'm trying to think of people like James Taylor, for example, his records are very kind of dynamic and there's a lot of vocal automation going on. And I actually find as a young mixer and like yourself, we're doing a lot of, I guess, commercial stuff or more modern day stuff. And I find that actually I'm compressing a lot these days. I try to compress so it doesn't sound squat, like too compressed, because that just sounds like you're overusing a compressor, but enough to enable me to actually not need to do much vocal riding, I find lately. And I know that some mixers will probably argue and say, oh no, you need to be doing a lot of automation, a lot of volume automation to create feel in the track. But I will say the way that we're going with all of this kind of pop vocal compression, I don't know if you're finding this as well, but I just find that the compressors, like you say, are bringing out so much that there doesn't seem to be a lot of dynamic in volume riding, especially in pop vocals. Now, some will argue, I don't know, what's your opinion on that?
Right. I think the key, at least for me, the best results I've gotten is trying to control the level a lot before it hits the compressor. Like I'll use something like Waves Vocal Rider.
Yeah.
And then that'll basically ride the vocal before it even gets compressed. And then you can also in Pro Tools use like clip gain. So if like the singer got really loud
I
on
use
a
that
part,
all the time.
Yep, you can just clip gain. So I think the better you really stage it, like before it even hits the compressor, the less we need a bunch of compressors.
Yeah.
And it still sounds very compressed, like you're saying, like a pop vocal sound. It'll still sound like that with less compression because you're really controlling everything before. Sometimes I even use a multi-band compressor before the actual compressor just to see like, okay, how much compression do I really need? Is it just kind of like a frequency problem? Is the vocal a little too muddy that's popping out, or is the high mids kind of getting at me a little bit on certain notes? Like you control that, and then all of a sudden you don't need as much compression as you maybe thought. Maybe 3 or 4 or 5 dB might be all you need, you know?
Yeah. That's you know, that's a really good point, because if you compress too much, like you say, you know, your mixes that don't become big. The way to get a
Yeah.
big mix is to not compress as much, yet still have that compression sound. So that, you know, what you said there, using riding a vocal or automation before it hits a compressor is a key part. I mean,
Right.
in Pro Tools, I love clip gain. I clip gain
Yep.
everything. I try, you know, I try and get everything kind of pretty solid before any of the plugins. And I also find that the plugins react better, and you know,
They do.
yeah, you know, from using a compressors, the harmonic saturation you get from a compressor, if you ride it too much, it can sound awful, and if you ride it too little, it cannot sound good. So you got to get that balance. I guess it's a vibe
Right.
and a feel thing. But you mentioned actually something interesting about dynamic EQ and multiband, and it's all kind of relative with the compressor. Are you finding then, as you said, if you're using dynamic EQ, you're not having to do as much compression beforehand? Is that what you were saying, or have I read that wrong?
Yeah. Yeah. So sometimes if say a vocal is pretty consistent as it is, but it's kind of got its problem areas, and the problem areas is what's making it really kind of sound like the need for compression. I'll try to fix those things first. So say, like I said, like something in the low mids making it muddy, or maybe there's like a honky frequency, you know, in the middle area of the mids. You know, I'll try to lightly compress just those areas, and then I get a better picture. Like, okay, well, how much compression do I need here? You know, like, and then I've just noticed that you get a smoother sound because when you really crush a vocal with compression, you're really gonna bring out the bad stuff like sibilance and breaths. The breath is gonna be like cutting like a knife, coming through, and then now you got to go through and automate all those breaths down. And depending on the source, you have to do that anyway, even with lighter compression. But when you really, yeah, when you really crush a vocal with a compressor, though, it's inevitable. Like you're going to have to be automating sibilance down and breaths and all that stuff because it gets really edgy. It gets a little too edgy, and it loses that smoothness that our ears are
Yeah.
used to hearing with like big mixes.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, do you find as well to like control like the low end, for example? You know, a lot of people always want to have this good low end, and I find that controlling the low end. I mean, I use a Pro MB fab filter, and
Nice.
I have that kind of between 0 and 100, and it just kind of
Yeah.
ducks slightly after after the compressor, because the compressor is going to react differently with the low end. So I'm doing a lot of kind of that. So in your workflow, are you doing multiband after the compressor as well, or before? I mean, I know you mentioned about doing it before to shape it, but do you do
Yeah.
any leveling after at all?
A lot of times I am doing it after, but, you know, like I said, there are those exceptions to where I'll do it before if a vocal is already sounding really, really good. Now, if a vocal's very dynamic off the rip, then I'll probably just get some compression going on and then do it. But if a vocal doesn't sound like it needs that much compression to start, then I may start with a multi-band compressor to just see how far it gets me, if that makes sense.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's a good way of doing it. Yeah. So are you, as far as we talked about kind of a little bit about harmonic saturation within the compressors and stuff. So obviously you go for the R compressor a lot because it's quite transparent. And then obviously the 1176 more for harder compression. And it also has a kind of sound. Are there any kind of other go-to compressors that you use on, let's say, guitars, like for a specific sound within a mix, or that you change every mix? Or have you, you know, let's talk about your go-to compressors then in a mix for different things, apart
Okay.
from, you know, the R compressor.
So yeah, I'll just go thing by thing. So for guitars, I do like this one company. You ever heard of Sturgis, Joey Sturgis, JST plugins?
Yes, yeah, they've got a good clipper.
Yep, the
Yeah.
Clipper, yeah. So he has some cool guitar stuff. He's got like a guitar glue bus, and I'll just put it on like the bus of all the guitars. I don't find it too necessary, if it's distorted or clean. I don't find it too necessary to have to compress each one, but if I do, it's very subtle. But I'll put that JST guitar bus on the all guitars bus and just kind of get a little compression on all the guitars. But I don't normally compress guitars too much because a lot of times they already kind of have a compressed sound by the time it goes to the amp and stuff.
Yeah, especially if it's all distorted guitars.
Yeah,
just get
especially
line.
yep. And then bass guitar, a lot of times I'm doing some light limiting with a bass guitar. But something like a LA2A can work just for a little bit of glue.
Yeah.
Drums, I definitely love like SSL stuff. I think it's really, really punchy. Same with API 2500. It's really good, like on a snare. It's got like a really smacking sound. And then I'll also use stuff like transient designers. So if I want like the snare to just hit harder, I'll bring out the Waves Smack Attack, and I'll just kind of I'll just boost that attack some or the sustain. So I really approach instruments a lot differently than vocals. I kind of just do the minimum in a way, or I'm kind of just straight towards the punch, So it's like drums, I listen to it, I'm like, okay, do they need more attack, more sustain, less? So transient designer could be great. But like I said, the API 2500 is a great drum compressor, which is what I found.
And does that go on your drum bus? Do you have do you have a drum bus, and do you put that on your drum bus?
Yeah, drum bus. Actually, that Joey Sturgis plugins has a cool drum one too. That's cool.
Fantastic.
1176 is a nice aggressive sound for drums as well.
Great. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned about the drum bus and the compression, because I did a mix earlier today, and I actually streamed it. But what I did is I felt like the drum compressor on the drum bus, because a lot of the mixes I get, a lot of the samples tend to be from Splice. And obviously Splice are just like limited and like
yep. You don't need much.
Like every time I get a mixer and it's from a producer that's just done it on Splice, everything is clip gaining down minus 10 dB literally before it hits anything. And I had all the drums going to a drum bus, and I put I think it was an SSLG compressor just on the bus. And I just didn't like the way the kick was hitting. I just thought the kick was just ruining the compressor. So what I've started to do is I've have a kick bus and a drum bus, but they both go to the mix bus. They don't go to the same bus, and it means I can then use a transient attack. Like what you mentioned, the Waves one, and just really push that kick to get that thump in the pot. And it means I can then back off the compression on the drums, and actually I can make the mix louder because I'm not squashing that low end so much. So it was interesting to hear that. Do you find that you ever do any of that kind of stuff, or not really?
Oh yeah, for sure. Kick can really be problematic sometimes if like you said, putting it all in one bus like that. Sometimes I don't even, if the drums are sampled, like you said, like if they're not live drums and they're just like samples, sometimes I won't even put those to a drum bus because, they're already kind of compressed. I'll just kind of do individual things, like maybe a transient designer on the kick and some EQ and, maybe some saturation on the kick. So it cuts through like different systems better and has that like mid range that maybe it's lacking and stuff. So,
do you find you ever use limiters instead of a compressor at all?
Yeah, a little bit. I like limiters, for sure. I was gonna say one thing I love to do is that Joey Sturgis plugins. They have something called Side Widener, which is like it's this awesome stereo imaging plugin. I'll throw that on like things like guitars,
Side Widener.
keys.
I haven't used that one.
Yeah, check that one out.
I'm gonna go broke after this.
It's a cheap one. I feel like it's like $40 or $30, but it's just a stereo widening plugin. But I'm telling you, it's different than any other stereo widening plugin I've used.
Why?
And I'll put it on things. I don't know. It just sounds very thick and just wide, and it's kind of like when you try the Waves, what is it, S1 or whatever, you do like the Waves S1, it kind of does something weird to get it to go wide. I don't exactly know why, but with this plugin, it literally just and you could turn a mono signal into a wide signal too. That's what's different about this plugin. You could literally put this stereo widener on a mono signal. Say somebody recorded like a piano mono for some reason. Like they sent it, I've had it before. Like
I've
somebody
had it
recorded
before.
a
I did
piano
2
part.
weeks ago.
Yep, and it's just a mono signal, and it sounds horrible in the middle. You put this plugin on there,
Yeah.
all of a sudden now it sounds stereo like you recorded it stereo. It's pretty wild.
I'm gonna have to try this plugin out. You've sold me. That's interesting to know. Yeah, because yeah, no, that's good because
I've honestly I've even liked it so much that I use it on vocals because if I go with like a subtle setting, it's basically got a width knob and a tone knob, and the tone knob doesn't do much, but I'll just play with the width knob
on BVs or on the lead.
I'll put it on the lead vocal, believe it or not.
Really?
And
Wow.
Yeah. And I'll barely push it just a little bit, and it makes the vocal from like this very, very stale kind of mono sounding thing to where it just widens it to where it made the vocal from this taking up this much space in the center image to now it's taking up this much space in the center image. It's crazy. It's kind of like just spreading it and making it like take up more real estate inside of it's still mono, but just wider mono, if that makes sense.
Fantastic. I mean, that's just good
Yeah.
to know. And that just goes to show break rules because, if you go to audio school, you will always be told to probably not do that.
Exactly.
But
exactly.
if it's, we're doing it for a job and we're doing it. So it just goes to show you, listeners, take everything, I guess, with a pinch of salt. There's no correct way of doing stereo widening or using a compressor. It's all about what feels good to you.
Exactly.
And it's so interesting, actually, watching different kind of mix videos. And, I'm a mixer, you're a mixer, and I'm sure we work kind of very differently, I guess, because it's we're different humans. And it just goes to show there's not one set way of doing something. So when it does come down to using a compressor, just experiment. If it looks weird, doesn't necessarily mean it sounds weird. It could just be with what you've been given as your stems.
Oh yeah.
I've done lots of things before where I'm like, why am I using 5 compressors? This is just overkill, but you've just had to on this particular thing. So yeah, no, it's good. So I find with using different compressors, do you find that you're compressing your overall mix? Because a few colleagues, we've got this kind of 50-50. Some people hate mix bus compression and some people kind of love it. What's your feeling on that, on mix bus compression? And do you use it? I mean, I've been using clippers lately on my mix bus instead of a compressor. So yeah.
Yeah, clippers are cool. It's not that I'm against mix bus compression at all. Like I've done it before. I've just haven't really found the need to. I've been normally putting Soothe on my mix bus, and then a multi-band compressor. So I guess it is sort of like compressing, but I put a multi-band compressor on my master or mix bus, whatever you want to say. But that is one of the biggest moves in every one of my mixes. For whatever reason, if you've never tried doing multi-band compression on your mix bus, it's a game changer. Like it will take your mix to where you take it off and you're like, oh wow, that's what I was hearing, and then you put it on, you're like, wow, that's great. It's
Can you
such
explain
a huge
to the
step.
listeners what you're doing?
Yeah.
I mean,
So
I know
basically,
every song's different. I mean, I don't know. Does your mix bus stay the same? I assume multi-band compression is going to change, but
Yeah. So I mean, obviously, yeah, you do multi-band compression maybe throughout the mix on individual channels, and that's great, and it works good. But then everything kind of comes together, and there's still certain spots to where like frequencies are building up and crossing over that make it just not sound the cleanest it could. I mean, we're human. We're going to miss some of these things when we're mixing, as good as anybody is. So when you put multi-band compression on your mix bus, you're basically tightening up all those little buildup areas. That's really what it is. It's just any areas, say like at 300 hertz, there's a buildup of like a guitar crossing over with, somewhere in the bass, and maybe like they didn't mesh good enough. So it's like you tighten that with the multi-band compressor, and then now all of a sudden your mix sounds beforehand it was kind of flabby, or it sounded like it was just, not as like flat. and then you put that on there, even with like some light settings, and it just smooths it out. So I
Fantastic.
basically have found that that's a little more powerful for me, at least, than just putting a compressor on it. But compression can have a nice glue, but I do a lot of times use some compression and like isotope when
Yeah,
I'm mastering and stuff. Anyway, or even like I'll use the vintage tape in isotope, like the
that's a good
tape
one. Yeah.
saturation. Yeah, and like that there will kind of like do the same thing, in my opinion, to a mix than a compressor would even.
It's good you're saying that, because I find sometimes when I'm getting kind of mixes through, or from whether it's producers and they're sending it, they always have like an SSL, a G compressor on their bus, and it's kind of like, the only reason why I think a lot of people are doing that is because it's kind of famous for it, but
It is famous for it,
but
yeah.
is it actually doing anything, or are you just putting it on there because you're like, oh, if I put it on there, I'm actually doing something right? And I
Right.
think it's interesting what you're saying about actually using something like Soothe or Dynamic EQ to do a similar thing. You may not exactly be doing what an SSL G compressor would be doing if you were using that, but what you might be doing might actually be better than what you would achieve out of an SSL G compressor. So it is definitely worth experimenting. And another interesting thing you mentioned about dynamic EQ, in my setup, I have a kick, drum bus, a guitar group, an all music bus, so keys and everything go to that. And I actually, before it hits the mix bus, I do dynamic EQ on each of the separate buses to clean it up before it goes
Nice.
to the mix bus. So it's that kind of thing going on as well.
Yep. Yep.
So
Same idea.
I'm
Yep.
I'm doing something right if you're doing the same. It's great when mixers chat, because you kind of go, oh, am I doing that?
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's so many different ways. I mean, even I've really gotten into parallel processing a lot, and that's in the last like 3 or 4 years I've really gotten into it. Whereas like the first 8 or so years mixing, I really didn't mess with parallel processing much, but there's really a lot of different combinations that you can do that's really cool. Parallel tape saturation, parallel vintage exciter, parallel EQ,
Are you
parallel
doing parallel
compression.
compression? Oh yeah, you are. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, yeah, but I'll try different ways, and whatever sounds best. But yeah, anything basically you could do in parallel, and it really can help just about anything. So
It's interesting with the parallel stuff, because I mean, what compressor do you find that you're using for parallel compression, or does it change depending on what it's on? I guess.
I mean, usually something that can slam it, like the 1176 or LA2A, or just, I mean, usually something with a pretty fast attack. So probably not LA2A, but
Do you do fast attack, slow release for the parallel? I think I do that, and all buttons in on the
yep,
1176.
yep.
Yeah,
Just kind of like squashes it, and then you can, just blend. Yeah, for
yeah.
sure.
No, do you know, I have like a love hate with parallel compression. I understand parallel tape saturation, like harmonic saturation, but I always find, to the human ear, obviously, if it's louder, it sounds better, right? But then
Mhm.
I'm like, if I do parallel compression or something, it's just making it kind of louder. So when I just take it off, I'm like, well, I could just turn up the volume. Like, but then
Yeah.
if it's like you said, tape saturation, it's something different. But yeah, I mean, do you find you're doing a lot of parallel compression more so than any
No,
of it?
honestly, that's the least. I mean, I
I'm
think
glad you
I'm
said that.
yeah, yeah, no, the most I do is parallel excitement. So I'll use something
Fantastic.
like this, like Slate Fresh Air. I'll use Slate Fresh Air, or like the Waves Aphex Vintage Exciter. I'll use something like an exciter, and I'll send like from the vocals, for example. I'll send from the vocals, and then I'll just barely blend it. And then when you mute it, it's crazy the difference it makes. It's like just adds like this shine that, yeah, I mean, you would think, oh, we'll just do it on an EQ, but it's just different. It gives
Different kind
you
of
a
tone.
slightly different, yeah, it's like it doesn't get harsh as easily as if you were to just go up and boost some 4K or something. Like it just kind of, it's more subtle, I think, than, but also very it's a strong effect, let's put it that way, but in a subtle way. It's sounds contradicting, but
Yeah, yeah.
it's
I know what you mean.
yeah.
Do you know, when anybody ever asks me, right, explain your mix process, I feel like I'm just contradicting myself the whole time. It's like, do this, but I
Right,
don't do
it
that,
is.
but I do it at the end.
That's how mixing is, man. It's very contradicting in a way. Like people are
It's a
like,
puzzle.
"Well, wait, last time you did parallel for the Slate Fresh Air, and then this time you're putting it straight on the insert." I'm like, hey, this time it worked, like,
Do you know what? People ask me, they go, "Oh, what compressor are you going to use today?" And it's like, we all have our go-tos, right? But
yeah,
sometimes it's just like, well, what day is it? I'm going to use a Fairchild today and just try it. If I like it, I'll
yeah,
use it. There is no set way of doing it.
right,
Um,
right.
but talking about compression, there's the Fairchild UAD Legacy has an amazing top end when you put it on a vocal. If you haven't
Nice.
tried it, yeah, check it
Nice.
out.
No, I haven't. Yeah, I haven't tried that. I have tried because I mainly use waves
Yeah.
for compressors, but I do use the what is it, the Pugue Child 660 here and there.
Oh,
It's like
yeah,
I think it's a form of Fairchild, and it actually has a really nice sound. I agree with that. So
yeah. And so talking about compression and kind of what are your things you like, I mean, explain to the listeners what when is a compressor used wrong, just so the listeners can understand about when is it right. I mean, again, contradicts myself, there's no right or wrong way, but for you as a mixer, if you're, what would you say is using a compressor wrong? By doing too much, feeling squashed, that kind of stuff? Is there anything that?
yeah, yeah. So basically, this is a good way to think about it. Like when you're gonna go with a high ratio, sometimes people go with a high ratio,
Yeah,
which is fine, but you want to go way less with the threshold then. So it's kind of like you could do it either way. You could have a high ratio and then bear a little bit of threshold, or you could do it the other way to where it's a low ratio and a lot of threshold. Those two things kind of give you similar results in a way. So I'd say you're doing it wrong if you're going with the high ratio and then you're cranking that threshold too much, Or another way you could really kind of screw it up is if you have a really dense mix and you want that like in your face vocal, like we were talking about, that vocal that's just concrete, that's just not going anywhere. If you're going with a really slow attack, it's really going to vary and you're going to find yourself just reaching for automation every 2 seconds. Vocal's going to be popping out too much. So going too slow can be kind of extra work for yourself.
yeah. So it's getting
Down
right.
the line when you mix. I mean, but there are certain guys that like the really punchy and like a lot of life in the vocal, but you just know that you have to probably do a lot more work later in the mix with automation and stuff to really get it good. I mean, especially when you get to mastering and you're bringing the limiter down and everything, it's like those things that are popping out because the compressor's too slow are going to sound too much at that point. It's going to be affecting now what your mastering limiters can do and how loud you can get your mix and stuff like that.
Do you find when are you mastering most of the mixes you're doing, or
Yeah, I do the majority of mastering for all my mixes.
and are you using in your mastering chain? Are you compressing or are you just limiting? Because I know some mastering engineers avoid compression completely because they just feel like the mix is already kind of compressed, and then they just use limiters. And are you using kind of compression in your mastering?
Rarely, I rarely do. I mean, if it's something like a live band with live instruments, I think it can benefit from a compressor like an isotope. But a lot of stuff I work with isn't. So it's like the instruments are like not live; they're just samples and stuff. And then the vocals are already processed really clean and nice. So a lot of times you don't really need it.
Yeah,
So I'll just do maybe some tape saturation just to warm things up or glue things up and just give it a nice warmth to it.
yeah,
But I will use dynamic EQ in isotope ozone as well. So usually I'll do the Wave C4, so multi-band compressor, and then after that's isotope. So I will do more additional multi-band compression technically. So in isotope, but it's subtle. It's very subtle. Maybe like a dB
yeah.
per band or something. It's nothing crazy.
Well, if it's a good mix, really, you should be doing very subtle stuff, shouldn't you? That's
Yeah,
what they say.
exactly.
But it's interesting
Yeah.
actually because obviously I mix, you mix. I do master some mixes depending. I mean, personally, I would prefer to send it to a separate mastering engineer, but it's not always the case, especially with budgets and everything. So someone like
Right.
yourself that you're saying that you're doing a lot of the mastering of your own mixes. Is that do you find, like, for me, I will do my mix bus and then I will keep my everything on the mix bus apart from the limiter, and I'll take that off, and then it will go to mastering. Because you're mastering a lot of the mixes you're doing, are you just adding that mastering onto your mix bus, or is your mix bus kind of doing the mastering part, if that makes sense?
Yeah, my mix bus pretty much is the master fader.
Yeah.
So, but like I said, if I'm working with something really dense with just a lot of layers, then it'll be like drum bus, um, you know, bass bus, uh,
my cat's
guitar bus, all that, and then it'll go to like an all instruments bus.
Yeah.
And then basically I'll be sending everything from an instruments bus to the master fader. So,
Okay. Yeah.
it just depends how dense, if it's really dense, 60 plus tracks. Yeah, that means more mix buses for sure.
Yeah. Fantastic. And do you prefer mastering your own mixes, or do you prefer sending it off in an ideal world? What's kind of your preference with
Yeah,
that?
I actually do. I prefer mastering my own mixes. I think it helps because I just kind of know how I mix, so it helps me know how I need to master it. And then also I do a lot of mastering only too, so I kind of do a good bit of just mastering work anyway. So a lot of people send me mixes and stuff to master. So I'm definitely well skilled in both.
So as a mastering engineer as well, are you finding that a lot of the mixes you get, do you find that they're using the compression properly, or do you find that a lot of people are
No,
using
it's
wrong?
bad. I mean, I try, a lot of times when I get mixes, I hear a lot of stuff, and I'm very thankful for things like mid-side compression, because if I couldn't do mid-side, then a lot of these things would be just not very good. So.
Well, talking about mid-side, actually, that's a great thing to talk about. So when you say mid-side, is that mid-side EQ or mid-side multi-band?
Mid-side everything. I mean, with with like I use like Waves F6,
okay,
which is that dynamic EQ. It's like each move you do could be, it could be mono or the sides. So say the guitars have like a really like bad gritty sound in it that like, you need to take out. You can literally put a dynamic EQ, find that, compress that, and then only have it on the sides. So say it was around 4.5K or something. Now we're not taking away from the vocal right in the center of the mix. We're only touching the outsides of the mix. So stuff like that is huge, a huge advantage being able to use that in mastering, because when your hands are tied and you just have a stereo track, you got to be able to do mid-side stuff, so
it's an amazing tool.
Yeah. Right.
So, talking about then let's do an overview kind of to finish off on about compression. What would be kind of your top, however many tips to look for when using a compressor, basically?
So if you're trying to learn compression, I'd say definitely understanding attack and release, like you said, definitely understanding that. And then also understanding, like I said, the types of compressors. They're all going to be slightly different, but in knowing when to use those compressors, because that, like for example, if it's like some rock singer that's really dynamic, I've tried like our comp and it just wasn't exactly what I was looking for, but 1176 is. Or for example, like I record my wife sometimes and her voice is very soft and just very consistent, but when I put the 1176 on her voice, it's like it makes it just super harsh and edgy, and it's just not what I'm looking for. It makes her voice less soft, less smooth. So just understanding what compressor is going to do what. So types of compressors, attack and release, and
experience.
Experience. Yeah, stacking some compressors is okay too. I mean, I've gotten some cool results with like using two different compressors simultaneously right after one another, and just you can do that. It works. You just have to be subtle with it.
Yeah. I think the problem with these days is there's just too many compressors on the market, isn't there, for plugins?
Yeah.
It's like it's just too much. It's like just you can do a whole mix on two compressors, couldn't you, really?
Yeah, that's why I only use a few. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
I've had a bunch of people ask me, other engineers, like, what compressors are you using? I'm like, dude, you'd be surprised. It's very simple. Our comp, 1176, LA2A. It's about it for vocals. I mean, I'll use some other ones for instruments, like I said, but for vocals, I don't go too crazy with it. If anything, I'm investing in plugins, like I said, like Soothe and
Yeah.
Dynamic EQ, and just things that are just a little more technical that are going to do something that a compressor can't, you know?
Yeah, of course. Do you find that you're getting a lot of mixes through that have been recorded with compression on, or when you record vocals, are you recording with compression on outboard wise, or not as much?
No, I have recorded with some outboard, but I feel it's pretty unnecessary. Especially
Yeah.
when you can just put a plugin on, you know, even a Pro Tools plugin for the person to hear while they're singing. You know, there's no latency or anything like that. You could just have them compressed, and that's just not touching the signal. I think it's better to just keep all the decisions for mixing later. And
Yeah,
um,
there's nothing worse than having a vocal that sounds amazing but just tracked with the most horrible compression. And you're like, well, can't do anything with that now.
yeah, it's really tough because once in a while I'll get a really picky client that like they're like, oh, I already mixed my voice, I already compressed it, put EQ on it, there's reverb on it, and I'm getting this like processed vocal. Which, I mean, I can still make it sound better, but it's still, at the end of the day, I'm listening, I'm like, yeah, it's still not my mix. I'm not gonna like be bragging about this mix, you know? Like I improved it. Yes, it was improved, but I'm not gonna be showing everybody that mix, you know?
That's fair enough. Well, John, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast and giving your expertise on compression. And for the listeners, it's incredible to have John on. He is very, very talented at what he does. He is the founder of Perfect Vocal Academy. Go and check out all of his stuff. Everyone learns as a mixer. Learn from each other. It's the way to be the best mixer. And, you know, as you say, there are no rules.
Yep.
John, is there anything you want to say? Any final words?
Yeah, I guess for anybody really trying to learn, I do have an online course. It's called the Vocal Mixing Masterclass. You can find that in the description of any of my YouTube videos. You can go to perfectvocalsacademy.com. Subscribe on YouTube. I put out a video every single Monday, and it's all tutorial style. So I literally just bring up a session that I mixed and show things of why I did what I did, and I don't really hold back. I don't like to hold back knowledge. I feel like everybody should just give and just do their own thing. You know, there's no competition in this world, really. It's all fake. So
it's the way to be. Well, you know, all the listeners, make sure you do go and watch those videos because it will help you. And like John said, we're all in it together. So let's all learn from each other. And
exactly.
Thank you again.